Welcome back to the Variety Show, Season 4, Episode number 6. Great to have your company as always. We're speaking with Thomas Dolby, great British musician who's had different career paths over the years. But for all of us here who love their vinyl, he will always be known as a fantastic musician. Love his work and was absolutely honoured to be able to take this time to be able to interview him, promote his new book, Prevailing Wind, which we have here. Great to have a copy of this. Could not put this down. It was such a fantastic novel to learn more about American history, especially to do with the sailing and all that, and about the races. So fantastic. And the whole real idea about it, with the two brothers going and entering in and trying out for this great luxury racing yacht, sort of whole premise idea of it, absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I must commend it. It reminds me really a lot of, his writing, especially with his music. So honestly, there could, who knows, if he was to ever put another album out again, I would love a concept album based on Prevailing Wind. So yeah, who knows, we'll have to see what time brings us. Anyway, without any further ado, we'll talk a bit more about the book. We'll talk about some absolutely great pivotal points of his career, the recent tour with Totally Tubular, and we'll explain a bit more about where you can find this great book if you also wish to pick it up. Anyway, without further ado, let's bring on the interview with Thomas Dolby. Welcome back to the Variety Show, Season 4, Episode 6. Here, probably one of my favourite episodes I've ever done. I wanted a long-awaited guest to come on the show. Thomas Dolby is a name that's well recognised in a few different parts of our life, whether it be through his music, his recent book, absolutely fantastic, Prevailing Wind, and also for some who may be aspiring composers, as a lecturer over in America as well. So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Liam.
We were talking about briefly just before recording the Totally Tubular Festival. So, this obviously was for you a bit of a big return to touring. When was the last time you've done a bit of a tour like this?
Well, I haven't done a tour like this since the 1980s, really. I've done sort of piecemeal, shows here and there, sort of oddball events, but never a sort of back-to-back tour like this. And frankly, it came about because I'm very often asked to do sort of rewind, lost 80s type tours, and I love doing them. But I think the challenge really is that you have to sort of balance it with how much interest is there in you doing any new stuff. Obviously, if all it is a walk down memory lane, then it's not terribly exciting in the long term. So I sort of balanced that stuff up, but this one came up and it was a good collection of other bands, some of them that I knew from the past. Very prestigious venues, very beautiful amphitheaters that we played, very well organized, and they only needed me to play for 35, 40 minutes. So that seemed like an ideal opportunity to jump back into some touring.
Yes, and then obviously you did England as well for
England.
a few more dates.
Yeah, I did England and one in Scotland, and that was a lot of fun too. And slightly different audience in the UK. Those are my own shows, my own hardcore audience, and they wanted a different selection of songs. Really, they're sort of more into the deeper cuts, less the hits. But that was a lot of fun too. Although I'd say touring in England is very hard compared to the USA.
Yeah, where most of the fan base has probably been since the Aliens era as well. So, but the cool thing is with the UK one, hearing for the first time I think since 2006, Airwaves, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So that was a really nice pullback into the set list. So, as well as touring there, I would also like to touch on roughly 10 years ago, you came for your only time here to Australia to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Fairlight CMI. So, this
Indeed.
opportunity to obviously play here, Australia, why was it never done until now? Was there just never any sort of financial opportunities to do it, or was there never much of a pull?
I don't know. I mean, I wasn't asked really, I suppose. And I'd love to do a proper tour in Australia. In fact, if anybody knows of some good stuff going on this summer, your summer, I'd love to come down in December, January, get out of the cold. But I
Hmm.
mean, if there's an opportunity to do something there, even a support tour or something like that, I'd be really into it and get to see some, other parts of Australia. I only really came to Sydney when I was there before. That was a lot of fun, but I'd like to see the rest of the country.
Yes, we do have a Timeless tour coming up, which is a lot of 80s names. You've got Tony Hadley, Boy George is another one of the names as well. So, yeah, I guess we'll kind of see. It could be a similar case to what you did with Totally Tubular, and is another big sort of 80s festival as well. That's how like Flock of Seagulls came down through that way. Wang Chung did as well. So again, another case of that.
All
So
right, well,
she'll
folks, send a letter to your local MP, request it, tell them it's time to get Thomas Dolby on the Timeless tour.
yes, be great. And here we are, sir. The new book, Prevailing Wind. How long has this been in the making?
Oh, a shockingly long period of time, about 5 years actually. My wife calls it six. She probably remembers when I started making notes for it. But yeah, no, I mean, it's something I've wanted to write all my life, really. I've been very passionate about the America's Cup for ages, which is going on now, incidentally. I don't know if any of your viewers are paying attention to it. Australia, of course, doesn't have a boat in the race, but you've got quite a few sailors in the race, including the American skipper and the Italian skipper, for that matter, um, Slingsby and Spithill. But no, I mean, it's so my favourite period for the America's Cup was actually the massive sailing yachts of the sort of turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, and I have always been fascinated with the technology and the technique and the fact these things were so huge. They took a crew of 35 or 40 men to sail them. And the men that sailed them were not the billionaires that owned them. The men that sailed them were mostly penniless fishermen and lobstermen from the Maine coast. And I decided to write a novel on this subject.
A very lovely book, and definitely one I'd recommend to people who obviously love reading, love your music, and I love a bit about the history of sailing. So, very lovely book.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
hopefully it's a universal story. You don't have to be a sailing fan or even very knowledgeable about sailing to understand it. But like a lot of historical fiction, there's a backdrop of something that you sort of need to take on board. I mean, you don't need to know about the Tudors and the Stuarts to enjoy like a historical fiction about the War of the Roses, or understand about how to design and build a cathedral in order to understand a historical fiction book. So, with a lot of historical fiction, there's something interesting to take on board as a backdrop. But hopefully, the story is universal. It's about two brothers who try out for the America's Cup team of a yacht owned by a sort of robber baron millionaire from the New York Yacht Club. And but I think there's a sort of mystery element to it, and it's hopefully thrilling and majestic, and I think people will enjoy it.
yeah. So, obviously, this all ties back in with a lifelong passion of sailing and boats. So, when it comes to this, what is your earliest and fondest memory of being on water in a sailing boat, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a fair amount of sailing in my time. I still have a classic wooden sailboat in the UK, which I sail when I'm back there in the summer. Amazingly, we won the so-called Worlds in my boat a few years ago, and at the time I thought, okay, this is going to be my absolute peak right here. There's no way I'm going to better this. I may as well just retire. But no, I love racing wooden sailboats, and I mean, it sort of started out when I was a toddler. My granny had a gorgeous black and white coffee table book with photographs of the old yachts, and that's when I first fell in love with them.
Would you be like one of those type of people that also has like the model ships around the house with like the glass bottles as well? Or
Yeah, I have a few models around the house, some sort of nautical knickknacks of various sorts, some interesting paintings from the 1900s and so on. So my wife shares my passion for that stuff, although she wouldn't be seen dead actually on a boat because she gets very badly seasick. So she always says, "Well, I'll drive around and I'll meet you on the other side."
fair enough. What's the water like then for you down there on your on side of America when it comes to sailing?
Well, I mean, where I live most of the year is in Baltimore, Maryland, which is on the Chesapeake, off the Chesapeake Bay. And it's an industrial harbor. It's not somewhere you want to go swimming, but it means that right outside our door we have a little motorboat, and I get to go to bars and cafes and even the grocery store by water, which is really nice. It's sort of like living in Venice or something like that. Um, you may have seen it on the news because we had a big collision of the bridge, across the harbor. The Key Bridge was brought down by a wayward tanker, so that was very exciting. But Baltimore is actually a great city. Around the harbor is very, very English. It's built largely by English sailors and expatriates. So the architecture is very familiar there, and it's a fantastic city with gorgeous neighborhoods. And the university I work for, Johns Hopkins, is really the sort of the biggest entity really in the city. That the very successful hospital, one of the top hospitals in the USA. A lot of research and medical science goes on there. But I'm in the Peabody Conservatory, which is an arts and music conservatory, and I teach film music there, and I've been doing that for a few years. And I tell my students it's the kind of course that I wish existed when I was their age, but there was nothing like that when I was 18, 19 in the UK. So I've pretty much created the course that I wish I could have taken myself.
Yeah, I came out of a bachelor's in screen media and communication, so yes, relevant, a bit probably more modern and somewhat more recent, but yeah, still applies and had a bit to do with radio as well, which is where I spend most of my time if I'm not doing the podcast, broadcasting on community radio. So very lovely course, and it has much applicability as anything, even though jobs are a bit more harder to get. It's more industry based. You gotta know people. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly true. I mean the flip side is that with prestige TV and indie films and so on, there's actually more composers being hired now than ever before, and it's easier and easier to make orchestral sounding scores because the sample libraries and workstations are so good. So there's a lot more career paths actually for students in that area. Many of the top composers, the Hans Zimmers of the world, have a team of 20 or 30 people working under them. So there's a lot of opportunities there for my students, and so we try and have them hit the ground running, after a 4-year course, so they can actually get working in the industry. And my first graduates from 5-6 years ago are in Hollywood now, working these jobs. So it's very gratifying to see that come around. No, I mean I've done a shamefully few number of movie scores myself, but then I guess I have that in common with a lot of university professors. It's something, being able to do it and being able to teach it are two different things. I'd like to get back to it and do a bit more, while I'm still working. It's fascinating to me, that the different disciplines involved in making good music for film and TV and games is just a very different skill from doing it for yourself. Yeah, it's something I'd like to do some more of.
Yes, I have only one of those scores, and from 1987, it's Gothic.
Okay.
So I got the Gothic soundtrack.
Yeah, it was actually done in 1985 originally, I think.
85,
yeah,
sorry. Yeah. So what you think of the soundtrack, and obviously remember of scoring for Gothic the movie?
Oh well, I mean it's a fantastic opportunity. It was a lot harder in those days than it would be these days to do that. Given the technology that was available. But I got to work with a real orchestra for the first time, which was a lot of fun. And sorry, I just needed to plug in my phone.
That's okay.
Yes. So yeah, that was a fantastic experience working with actually the London Symphony Orchestra, members of the London Symphony Orchestra, at a great studio in London. And Ken Russell, who is no longer with us, is he was the director of the film Gothic, very knowledgeable man about music. You know, some of his early work was doing BBC documentaries about the great composers. And he's a bit of a terror on the set, but his favorite part of the whole filmmaking process is working with composers on the score. So it was great to be involved in that, and really good experience all round. But had I waited another 10 years to do it, it would have been an awful lot easier given the technologies that were in the pipeline at the time.
Hmm. Well, definitely, in amongst, I guess in those days when samplers were all the rage, there's little pots of these great soundtracks that were coming out. So, yeah. So, first off, happy 40th anniversary to The Flat Earth for February. Absolutely solid record. And I'd like to go through some of the songs with you, if that's all right. So, starting with Dissidence. When I found out about the meaningful on this year, I was absolutely thrilled for that one, because absolutely one of my favorite album openers. To hear that you were sort of angry at the record company for trying to put you in a box, if you will, for trying to make another Blinded Me with Science. What does Dissidence mean to you? And will it ever come back to a concert set list?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to do with a live band. I think actually the only time I've done it was when I had a sort of a Flat Earth reunion show at the Union Chapel in London with some of the musicians that had played on that album, and we sort of recreated that song. But it was quite hard to do without samplers and sequencers and so on. What does it mean to me? Well, I suppose I identify with the sort of underground resistance in terms of writing and music and so on. I've always considered myself fairly sort of on the fringes, of music. Back in the day, I would listen to the radio, and I felt a lot of the stuff on the radio was pretty mediocre. So I was trying to do something that was a little bit more, with slightly more lofty goals. And interestingly now, 40 years later, with the threat of AI music sort of taking over, it's actually not much different. The challenge still is to do something that is so quirky and individual that it really stands out on its own. But I think that the dissident aspect was just identifying with somebody that has to write and has to create and broadcast, despite the personal risk that you take, because you are going against the grain. And so it just sort of led me down this path of using metaphors from the sort of dissident writer era, from the lyrics to the music video and so on.
It's a fantastic music video as well, capturing some of the elements of the espionage Cold War, which Jethro told Peter John Vitez and Ian Anderson would take elements of and be inspired for their September release of Under Wraps, we'll get to in a bit with Hyperactive. Another song I wanted to touch on is Screen Kiss, which I believe for me has developed a bit more of a meaning, and probably for you as well, as you performed it for Matthew's passing in 2020. So yeah, Screen Kiss, what does the song mean to you?
Well, it's very personal. It was about a love affair gone wrong, a sort of doomed love affair. And at the time I was sort of flirting with Hollywood myself. I loved the idea of heading out there and getting involved in the film industry. It was always sort of an aspiration of mine. So interestingly, in about 2002, there was a rap outfit called D12, who were produced by Eminem and Dr. Dre on the Interscope label. And they did an amazing song about one of their comrades that was shot down between their first and second album. And the entire song is based on a slowed down loop of the intro to Screen Kiss. And I was only made aware of this a couple of months ago, and it's kind of amazing actually. It's like it's a really great song, and it got great comments on YouTube. But if you go in and listen to it, it's very clear that it's the guitar intro to Screen Kiss slowed down a bit that they just rap over the top of. It's kind of flattering that they would use that.
It's definitely a bit of a left field pick, because no one, I think it's a bit of an album cut pick in my opinion, much like Dissidence. Not many people do know about it unless you dig into the album. So yeah, Screencast
Yeah.
definitely my favorite one from the album. And much like the music video Mul The Rainforest, we too here in Australia have the massive red oak wood trees that are seen in the Otways. They're beautiful, beautiful sight.
Mm.
And it was pretty cool to see you sit amongst them in the 2012 music video that accompanied the song.
Yeah, I mean, I'd actually that came about because drone camera work was very new, and I met this drone operator in California who wanted some good subject matter. So we headed out to the redwoods and did that. But Mul The Rainforest, actually, the song itself was very much inspired by a Peter Weir film called The Last Wave, I think it was called, which was set in Australia. I think it was from the late mid 80s, maybe early to mid 80s. And it was basically about some tribal aboriginals that had been displaced by a city, but who had foreseen sort of the end of days with a big wave coming and wiping everybody out. And that was the sort of the mood behind the book was very inspired by that film. So that might be one to dig out.
Okay. I can definitely tell the sense of it, like it's like in a big connection to nature. So, but I had no idea that it was inspired by our sort of our First Nations culture in Australia. That's really cool. So obviously, got to talk about Hyperactive, the big song from the album. I mention this because when I interviewed Peter John Vettez all the way back in 2021, he hints and alludes at that the elements of the optical illusion from Hyperactive with the box head inspired them to do the thick as a brick illusion at the end of their Underwrap show. So they were noting that, and he remembers seeing one of the shows and seeing obviously what was meant to be you on stage with the iconic box head on, but obviously I think you were either stage left or stage right, out of sight, still singing, and then you come on stage, reveal off the box head that it was Howard Jones. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, I mean, so I only did that once at the Dominion in London, but through the whole tour, my keyboard roadie would dress in the same outfit as I had, and so I'd go off stage and come on with the box head, and it was actually him, not me. So I was able to then come on in duplicate from the other side of the stage in the same outfit. And the night that I did it at the Dominion, I managed to talk Howard into doing it instead.
Is the song biographical by any chance, or is it just some?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely autobiographical. I mean, I was a fairly hyperactive kid. I was the youngest of 6 kids, and the rest of them were much older than me and very academic. And so it was really down to me to sort of jump up on the table and do a song and dance. So I definitely had that element of hyperactivity.
About your work with Foreigner for the 4 album, she absolutely adores the hits from that one, and we wanted to know a bit more about your work on that one, especially with the synth arrangements for Waiting for a Girl Like You, Urgent. So what was it like working with the boys from Foreigner?
So, I was actually broke at the time. I was living in Paris working as a street musician, and I got a call from a friend in London saying Mick Jones is trying to get a hold of you. And I thought, oh my God, The Clash, one of my favorite bands. But it wasn't that Mick Jones. It was the other Mick Jones, who was a great guy as well. But anyway, I headed out to New York. They said, come for a couple of days and let's see what you can do. And when I got there, they really liked the sounds I was coming up with. So they asked me to stay a few weeks and do the whole album. But they were already on a deadline for the vocals, getting the vocals done. So they pretty much left me on my own at night in the studio and they'd say, we got these 5 or 6 tracks to fill up, do whatever you like. So I actually created that intro to Waiting for a Girl Like You sort of in a back room at Electric Lady Studios. And I had limited synthesizers to use at the time, so I actually created it one note at a time and just used up several tracks and sort of created this mesh of ambient synth sound. and I wasn't sure if they would like it. But they came in the morning and listened, and I played it, and there was sort of a long pause. And then the bass player said, it's sort of like massage music. And Mick Jones were really into it, and they thought it would make a really different kind of intro to a single. So, and it became, I think, one of their biggest ever hits.
It's a fantastic synth, and even I've been playing that one around on keyboards. I think the Uberheim like VSTs have some similar synth sounds, so it's a great one to definitely play around with. And another band, obviously, as you can see behind me, I have the Set album. So obviously, you reunited 40 years on the Totally Tubular tour with Tom Bailey, and you have a bit of history with the Thompson Twins being on there during the Set era, doing all sorts of synth work again. So working with Tom Bailey of Thompson Twins, what was that like for that experience to work with it at the time? Then an up and coming group that were destined for stardom.
Yeah, so I mean, my friend Matthew played bass with them at the time, and he introduced me to Tom Bailey. And interestingly, when I reconnected with Tom a few months ago for the Totally Tubular tour, um, his memory had filled in a blank, and he thought that it was him that played the intro to that. That's what I did. So he's misremembered that one. But no, I mean, it was. That was round about the time they were just shrinking down from, I think, a 9-piece to the 3-piece that ended up becoming very successful. So it was great to reconnect with Tom, and he's a really good guy, and his set was fantastic. And I got to see it many times over because I'd be standing at the side of the stage waiting to come on for my set when they were finishing their set. So I got to see the last few numbers of Tom's set probably 20 or so times.
There you go. Yeah, so it's a 7-piece band before they shrunk down to the 3. It's a beautiful album set, probably my favorite of the early stuff. And yeah, I've got the Runaway single probably somewhere in there. Whether I dig it out or not is another thing, but yes. So, when I spoke with Charlotte Raven, I believe it was, also from Tom Bailey's band in season 2, she mentioned she's Ryoichi Sakamoto fan. And obviously, I remember the Fieldwork single, which I'd picked up, I'm going to say probably 2017, 2018. Not as easy to find here in Australia as you think. It's a bit of a rarity to come by, but I still managed to pick up a New Zealand promo pressing of the Fieldwork single.
Oh, look at that.
It's absolutely wonderful song, and with such a great collaboration between yourself and such a well-regarded Japanese composer, what was it like to work with Ryoichi Sakamoto? And he only passed away only just recently, so it'd be good time to recover some memories.
Yeah, I mean, he was a very sweet guy. Interestingly, when I worked with him originally, he only spoke a word or two of English. The last couple of times I saw him, he'd been living in New York for years, and he was fairly fluent in English. And it was my first experience, really, of somebody who originally you could only communicate with sort of hand signals and via music, who suddenly had sort of found his voice in my language. He's a brilliant musician. We'd met originally because his then wife Akiko Yano sang on my first album as a backup singer, and so we made that introduction. And years later, he had come up with this. He was making an album for himself, and he'd come up with this groove with Steve Jansen, the drummer from Japan, and he sent me the groove and said, "Could I write a melody over the top of it?" And I came up with the melody and the lyrics for Fieldwork, and we agreed to meet in New York to record the vocals. And we both checked into the Midtown Hilton in Manhattan under assumed names. So we'd arranged to meet there, but we couldn't actually find each other because I had no idea what room he was in. And we each had to call our respective managers in Tokyo and London to make the connection, which was a bit Spinal Tap, I think.
It's a brilliant song, and his legacy will go on and be remembered. Kraftwerk did, what is it? Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence in Tokyo this year to honor his legacy, and another brilliant electronic artist of that era. One of the, I think this one, Love You Goodbye, this single, and also the song itself doesn't get that played that much, but it came back to fruition certainly on the England leg of the current tour, but did a couple of spots here and there in the USA. When was the last time we saw I Love You Goodbye, and what connections and memories do you hold to the single from 1992?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite songs, actually. I mean, it was sort of based on a real life experience with a good friend of mine who had been my neighbor in Los Angeles when I was living there, and who decided to move to New Orleans. And I went down to visit him and had a little adventure out in the bayou. But I Love You Goodbye was pretty much, I knew that I wasn't going to see as much of him anymore now that he was living in New Orleans. I've seen him on and off over the years, and actually I played in New Orleans on the tour at the House of Blues, and he came along with some friends. And so that was when I decided to revive the song and add it to the set.
Yeah, it's a welcome comeback and an absolutely fantastic piano intro. If we may go back to Hyperactive just briefly, wanted to touch on obviously the parody Weird Al did for 1985's Dare to Be Stupid, Slime Creatures from Outer Space. Were you ever made aware of Weird Al's style parody of Hyperactive?
Every day, and they just won't go away. Now they're reproducing in the sewers. They got slimy lizard skin and an evil-looking grin, and they sure could use some manicure.
No, I didn't know Weird Al had done it. I remember him. He did a parody of "She Blinded Me with Science" that I don't think ever made it onto a record, called "He Bought Me an Appliance."
That's cool. Oh my goodness!
But so what? I didn't realize he'd done a Hyperactive parody. What was it called?
It was called. It's a style motif one, which is the one where it doesn't directly do a song parody, but it's done in the style of an artist. So it's called Slime Creatures from Outer Space, and it's a real deep cut. Only ever got played on the Stupid Tour in 1985.
Okay, all right. I have to look that one up. Hopefully it's on Spotify or something.
It is on Spotify. It's an absolutely great song, and it captures the energy of the original 1984 track. Yeah, I thought maybe you may not ever have come across it before, because I know he usually asks for permission for all of his work, so maybe it was one of those occasions where you didn't have to.
Yeah.
So, going back to 1982, 1983 with the first album, going to a song called Weightless. I don't think you've really ever talked about this one. What's the meaning to this one, or what draws to you when I speak of this song?
Yeah, I mean, it's another personal experience thing. What do I think about it? When I first came to the USA, I couldn't really make it out. It seemed like a sort of parallel universe, really, to the UK. And I shared a very torrid time in New York with a French girl, actually, who was also the subject of Europa and the Pirate Twins. And she was the one that came up with the line "fruit juice everywhere," which I credited her for on the record. No idea where she is now. That would be an interesting thing to do some research into.
Okay, well, one for the books then. The Wreck of the Fairchild. Now, I think it kind of relates back then to lost ships and all that. So, is there potentially a ship out there, a wreckage called the Fairchild, or is it something else completely?
Actually, it was sort of inspired by a book about a plane crash in the Andes when a rugby team, I think it was an Argentinian rugby team, crashed in the Andes, and they ended up, in cannibalism and despair. and the plane that they crashed in was a Fairchild. Now, Fairchild is also, I don't know if it's the same company, but there was a valve limiter, which is very much coveted by studio producers now, which I had in the studio. And it took a while to warm up. And until it was warmed up, it made a weird sort of distorted sound. So there was just a pleasant coincidence that I'd been reading that book about the plane crash. And using a Fairchild valve limiter in the studio. So it became the Wreck of the Fairchild.
Yeah, it's a brilliant little instrumental piece at the start, obviously, a bit of vocals. Towards the end, segues nicely into Airwaves, another one of my favorite songs from the album. Wind Power as well is definitely another one of my favorites. I actually picked up this one in a few different lots as well. This one came from South Australia. What do you remember much of this single?
I didn't record it as a single. It was just another song from the album that I recorded that people evidently liked very much. It was quite daring, actually, of my record company to release it as a single.
There's one album that I haven't touched on yet, and I'm looking for it. Aliens Ate My Buick, and it was a bit of a real huge change in different direction. More getting on a bit of a funk there with some of the songs. You've called back to look upon the album in less of a light than you have probably the first two albums. Do you still feel the same that way coming onto its 40th anniversary in a few years' time?
Yeah, I'm very fond of Aliens Ate My Buick. I had a great time doing it. I sort of did it a different way from any of the other albums because when I first moved to Los Angeles in 1986, I put a band together to go out and play in some clubs. And I composed, those songs pretty much for that band. And we had played them live, a number of times before we ever went in the studio and recorded them. So typically it's the other way around with me. I do my work in the studio and then have to figure out how to play the songs live. This is a different way around. And it has a, much more sort of extroverted feel than most of my albums. It was pretty much a postcard home to England from LA. It's sort of, hey mum, I'm having a great time. That was pretty much the essence of that album. And it was a lot of fun to do. It's like a lot of it is sort of fairly tongue-in-cheek, fairly risque. It was politically not very correct in some ways, and people like to remind me of that. But it's at the same time it's got some really good cuts on it, and sonically it's a great sounding record. A lot of sound engineers use pulp culture to test out their speaker systems, so you hear that live at a lot of festivals and so on.
That's really cool. I love that. Yeah, Budapest by Blimp obviously is another great one that gets featured on the set lists as well, and Airhead, which has been more or less the encore for a good few years through your tours, and a lovely music video as well to accompany that in similar artsy fashion to Hyperactive with a 2D Dolby that's remote controlled. I love that. I
really don't remember, actually. I think I've been watching some puppetry of various kinds and sort of decided that would be a fun thing to do. I think with music videos, I was always trying to stretch out and do something other than the typical, standard MTV fare. So I can't remember what the inspiration was for that.
I think one that I found most surprising that a modern artist like Billie Eilish, for example, I was not expecting her to say, "Oh yeah, I love Thomas Dolby's work." So that was a really cool thing to see, like someone who's a bit more mainstream these days. Really enjoy your work.
It was great to find out that Billie was a fan of my music. And in fact, her dad, has been to see me play live, I think 6 or 7 times, and sort of brought up his kids, Billie and her brother, Finn, on my music. And so it's very cool to find that podcast in which she and her dad are like waxing lyrical about my songs. And to hear Billie singing along with Evil Twin Brother is hilarious. So, your listeners should definitely check out their podcast.
Oh, definitely will. I have to look at that because I remember when I heard the news, and it's absolutely great. More modern artists listening to sort of mainstream, well, not mainstream, well, artists of a generation or a decade gone by and still loving the music. Well, that's all the time we have here for On the Variety Show with Liam for another great edition to the podcast. Thank you as always for tuning in, and hope you learned a thing or two about Thomas Dolby's career that you maybe hadn't have heard of. Whether it be a story or a background to a song that you love, hope you took away something today and you can tell your friends and your family. Anyways, for the book, you can go to Amazon.com, links in the description for that one if you feel so wish to incline to help support Thomas Dolby's newest project and newest creation. A fantastic book, as I said earlier at the start of the video, a great one, and highly loved by some of the greatest names also in America's pop history, and some other names as well that who have absolutely adored this book. You'll check it out on the back of the blurb when you get the book. If you want to check out some of Thomas Dolby's newest music, you can go to his official YouTube channel. You can go to your preferred streaming services of choice to find out what new stuff has been put out. I see that there is a new copy of the Flat Earth 40th anniversary, which brings out the album once again with some new additions that may have already been put out before in the past, but it's always good to see them again. And as always, make sure you flip your vinyls to the B-side, and until then, we'll see you all later here on The Variety Show with Liam, and I hope you had a fantastic time. Peace. Have a good one.